Hello, I'm Bradley Alicea, and today I'll be presenting on something called Gibsonian information, an agent-based paradigm for quantitative information. I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-authors Jesse Parent, Avery Lim, and Daniela Cialfi, and we're from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory. So, to talk about Gibsonian information, we first need to talk about Shannon information. And as a review here, Shannon information is the basic encapsulation of that is that variety provides information. We take the probability of one state in a set of states, and we're looking for structure out, getting structure out of randomness. And so this is a shorthand for Shannon information. We have encoding of information and decoding of information from a binary channel with noise. And we can characterize that with the above equation, the parameter h. This measures efficient transmission of a signal over a noisy channel, and it results in an expected versus an unexpected set of configurations of a system. So some configurations have more information than others. Now, on the other hand, Gibsonian information is a little bit different. In this case, we were explicit about motion providing information. And so motion can mean a number of things. It can mean something like optical flow. It could also be relative motion between the object and the observer. So an object in the environment versus the observer. If the observer's in different locations, it's a different type of relative motion. And finally, there's structure from motion, and we'll go through some of those examples in a little bit. This is the shorthand for Gibsonian information. So this differs from Shannon information in that there's an encoding channel where you're observing external information, which is spatio-temporally dependent. So there are all these objects in the environment. They're distributed in space. They're encountered with respect to time. And this conforms to a Poisson distribution, which you can see as IT. And this Poisson distribution measures things as they arrive in the perceptual purview of the agent. So you have things that you come up upon in time, you have things that you come up upon in space. From different perspectives, you see different types of Gibsonian information, and all of that is encoded into this internal communication channel, which is characterized by this Poisson distribution plus this parameter tau. And tau can represent some sort of lag or some sort of transformation of those states and their arrival times into an internal representation. And then finally, there's decoding of Gibsonian information, which is how it affects behavior. And so this tau can be appended to the Poisson distribution in a number of ways. You can have an additive version of it, and you can have a multiplicative version of it, which you can see here. So this information, once it's inside the agent's internal model, can be transformed in a number of ways. So this leads us to highly patterned inputs, which we get from the environment. This results in a noise-free internal representation with temporal accumulation. When I say noise-free, I'm being optimistic. There can be some noise within that representation, but generally that transformation will override the noise of the channel. And then that leads us to expected patterns in external communication channel and minimally noisy internal communication channel. So this gives us these two different external and internal systems. So we can compare Shannon versus Gibson information in a number of ways. We can look at words that we associate with Shannon information, such as surprise, which is something they use in cognitive science, heterogeneity, diversity. In Gibsonian information, those analogs are flow, movement, and contrast. In Gibsonian information, we deal in disjoint distributions. So we compare things, we compare the difference between sets. Whereas in Shannon information, we're more interested, at least in mutual information, in the joint distribution between sets. And then finally, in Gibsonian information, all the information is deeply spatially temporally dependent. So this might come in the form of a distributed time series that's distributed in space, or some other highly structured information coming in, whereas Shannon information is generally independently distributed according to some sort of normalized probability distribution instead of something that's exponential. And so this leads us to potential measures like maximum coherent movement, minimum coherent movement, and flow rate capacity. And they map to Shannon information measures such as maximum entropy, minimum entropy, and channel capacity. So the takeaway from all of this is that Gibsonian information is about extracting information directly from the environment. And this is what we call direct perception in cognitive science, and we're applying this to information theory. So now we move on to looking at more of this direct perception and how we can unpack direct perception into the internal communication channel. So one important feature of stimuli is that there's direct multimodal information that's acquired as you're doing this direct perception. And so let's use the simulation of a roller coaster to demonstrate the direct multimodal perceptual information. So in this case, we have a roller coaster simulation, and you're experiencing the visual flow of the simulation. You might also experience forces of the simulation, but not directly, not in your proprioceptive channels, but in your visual channels. You're getting visual cues of force and inertial movement, but you're not getting the actual feedback in the proprioceptive channel. That's important to remember, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. The observer experience determines richness and detail of the internal representation that results from this. So the observer is, maybe if they have experience with a roller coaster, they can actually feel the feedback, although they don't experience it directly. And that's something that they're gaining from their internal representation of riding a roller coaster, whereas someone who's never ridden a roller coaster before will get different Gibsonian information from the scene. So there are a couple points to point out about this simulation. The first is that we have these cues that are flow, motion, and contrast, and they play an important role in building that internal representation of this scene. And you can have multiple internal representations that feed into this. So, ostensibly, you could ride a roller coaster and then observe this simulation and get the information of that experience, and it will contribute to the Gibsonian information of this scene. Also, we're interested in disjoint distributions. So what that looks like is that, let's suppose we have these two scenes here. One is dynamic static, and the other is static static. And one is, of course, moving in your visual field, and one is not. And so what we're interested in with Gibsonian information is taking this feature, and this is not a feature of the roller coaster ride, but it could be, comparing these two scenes and getting the differential information out of it. So there's differential information in terms of movement. These static pieces of static, they are not moving around. It's just that the different parts of the scene are changing their state, or there may be some motion, but you have to interpret it with respect to the static view. So you have these moving versus stationary pixels, and this is how disjoint distribution is calculated. It's calculated as the difference between the two scenes. And this differs from Shannon information, where you're interested in the two different variables and the information of those two variables, how much they overlap. So in this case, we have mutual information of 0, but in Gibsonian information, that same array is highly informative, or can be highly informative. We also have time series structure, and this is temporal dependence. And so we talked about spatiotemporal dependence before, but this is a nice example from this movie that I have of people being chased down a hill by a Zorb. In the top image, there's a whole group of scenes that happen, and there's this sequence of events that you can follow. So it's easy to see that the ball is traveling down the hill towards these people. They're getting caught by the ball, it rolls over them, and it's chasing them down the hill. At the bottom, you can see that this is a little bit more disjointed. I've taken some frames out of this animation to demonstrate that when you take different parts of the temporal sequence out of place and you pull them out and you put the remainder back together, that you get this disjointed scene. And in this case, of course, this is related somewhat to disjoint distributions, because now we're looking at this dynamically and we're saying for each frame, what is the difference in information? And so when you're viewing the top movie versus the bottom movie, there's a different Gibsonian information content in this comparison. And of course, imagine if you trained an agent on the top movie and then you presented it the bottom movie, would they be able to interpret the bottom movie as being part of the top movie, or would they not? And so that's where disjoint distributions and time series structure become important. More generally, this relies on this concept of contingent action. And so on the right, you can see a binary tree of different states and different outcomes. And so each node has information that the previous node it leads to. So there's a consistency across time and across events unfolding. And in contingent action, we expect this structure. And when there's disjoint distributions involved, you're taking nodes out of this tree, and you're sometimes you cut the flow of action completely, sometimes you don't. the final point here is that there's a maximum versus minimum coherent movement standard. So we were looking at these different movies, these different actions, like a roller coaster simulation and people being chased by a ball. And those are not what I'm talking about here. This is more coherent movement. So in this case, we have at the bottom, we have a school of fish. It's a flock of boids, I think, more specifically. But the idea is they're exhibiting collective behavior. They're coming together and they're forming these swarms. And the swarms move around in a way that maybe can be interpreted as a higher level structure. And this can be contrasted with, say, a bunch of balls moving around a space randomly. They're bouncing around randomly, and there's no maybe coherent movement in the random case, but in the swarm case, there's actually a high amount of structure in the coherent movement. So the question is, can an agent differentiate between these two types of movement and characterize the information in the bottom image versus the top image? And so in this case, coherent movement can both be measured from afar. So a single agent can look at a bunch of some collective behavior and assess the information content. Or what sometimes happens within swarms is that you have an agent that looks around at its neighbors and tries to assess the global state from the local position. And so that's where coherent movement also comes into play, where the agent is looking around, assessing the movement of its neighbors, or maybe assessing the movement of parts of the flock versus like a random movement standard, and making a decision about how much information there is, and then maybe what kinds of things to do next, what kinds of behaviors to execute next. So that leads us to this example called 4-channel embodiment. And we talked about this with the simulation of the roller coaster. So in this case, we have 4 sensory channels, and each channel captures information from an action sequence in a specific modality: vision, haptic, proprioceptive, and auditory. So the idea is that these pieces of information should be congruent. And the question is if they're not congruent, then there's less Gibsonian information. And if they're coherent, then there's more Gibsonian information. And we'll show what coherence is with this example of a rabbit hopping and observing this rabbit. So follow the white rabbit. You're doing this in different sensory modalities, and you're keeping tabs on each sensory modality to see where the information is coming from. And you can see that they can, they can interact or they can be disjoint. And so here we have an example of how you would measure this. This is not using a set of equations, but this is using a symbolic language where you have these different sensory modalities, and you're looking at the direction of motion, but also the whether it's direct perception or some sort of inference, which you're observing things indirectly. So in this case, forward motion is going forward. It's being observed directly. Haptic information is being observed indirectly. You could maybe feel it with your eyes. That's not really direct perception, it's indirect perception, but there's still forward momentum. The proprioception part is maybe some sort of shift to the left. And the auditory sensation is birds chirping in the background. This gives it some naturalistic context. And so, naturalistic context, of course, is important in seeing these scenes and assessing Gibsonian information. And it's something we can also do with this scene where this person is manipulating a virtual object. In this case, we have much different set of things that we're looking at across modalities. We introduce something called rotational momentum, which is direct, forward motion, which is direct, but there's also force feedback, which is sort of implied. It's sort of indirect in this case, but we expect it in the real world case. So we can pull these sensory modalities apart and actually begin to sort of probe inferred perception using virtual environments. And so finally, there's this Shannon versus Gibsonian information comparison in navigation. So thinking about cognitive maps used in navigation, we can look at an agent, and this is a Brainberg vehicle where they're observing different scenes, visual scenes, environmental scenes from different perspectives as it's moving around in a rotational direction. And so there's optic flow that's generated from this scene, and then the perceiver moves along a path of travel, and those two things interact, and you can measure them using these different tools for multi-sensory integration and different distribution criteria. So thank you for your attention.